Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation that I'm delighted to present for the second online International Doctoral Research Conference in Education. My name is Catherine Smith and I'm a final year PhD researcher based in the Department of Education at the University of York. My email address is on this slide and will also be on my final slide, as well as my Twitter if you wish to reach out or have any questions, and I will do my absolute best to answer them for you. So let's crack on, shall we? Here's an overview of what I'll be covering today. I'll be running you through some background to my research. Don't worry, I'll keep it brief. I'll then sum up the relevant information on the canon and forms of culture before a whistle-stop tour through Cox's models. Then to the juicy part, I'll talk about some of my findings and their implications and the links to teaching of English literature and social justice. Finally, there'll be a quick summary and time for your questions as well. So firstly, we're going to talk about some background. My working title comes from one of the novels that I've worked with as part of my research, Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In the context of the novel, the quote refers to having two halves or sides. Dr. Jekyll explains that his intentions were to split himself into two personalities, into a good and evil being. Now, none of my participants were quite this stark in contrast, or indeed evil. But a recurring theme in my pilot data and my main data is this idea that my participants are at this stage in their lives where they are radically both. They are teenagers, but they are also on the verge of adulthood. They are passionate about their engagement with the classic text, but do make many pop culture and current links to the characters and stories to make sense of them. And they have good personal links with the characters and themes, as well as bad ones. I thought this was an interesting way to bring all of my participants together who are studying different novels of a selection available, with different themes and different characters, but making sense of them in very similar ways. In addition to this, the both to me means the importance of teaching much beloved, or not, depending on personal tastes, canon text, but also acknowledging that there does need to be the extra support alongside the text of theory and context to enhance the understanding of the novel, but also as a site for sometimes problematic elements to be brought out in the open in the English classroom. Sometimes research in this area seeks to propose a new canon or rule out certain texts, but I believe that every text has potential in the English classroom if taught with Cox's models in mind. I'll go into more detail about this shortly. And finally, with the both, something that is emerging so far in my data analysis is how the 19th century novels my participants encounter in both reading and understanding the text, but also about the ways in which they can learn from the characters, themes, and historical context and relate them to the present day. The study of girls and young women presents an opportunity to explore how they negotiate their identities in the context of reading and literature. Blackford, 2004, says that stories of female experiences could be sites of negotiating female identity, and that girls represent a crucial and problematic site of socialization. So this is kind of giving you some context about why I've chosen to work with girls specifically. Pre-pandemic, my sample was set to be secondary schools based in North Yorkshire. This was because of location convenience, as before Zoom, trains and travel would eat through my research budget pretty fast. I kept this location the same after, during, in, where even are we at this stage of COVID, because I'd already formed relationships with some of the schools I ended up using. In fact, I was set to go into several schools the weeks following up to the first lockdown in the UK, so I tried to keep contact with as many of these as possible. Obviously now with Zoom being part of my methodology, I would potentially have opened up to more schools around the country, and perhaps if I ever decide that I'm mad enough to do another PhD, I would probably take that as a course of action. But yeah, so secondary schools in North Yorkshire. I'm currently at 35 participants in total. This is students because I'm also working with staff, but we're not going to be talking about that today. And the majority of my data actually was collected via Zoom, but some was pre-pandemic. I should note that data collection for my final score is still in progress at the time of recording this presentation, so I might have more to say on this during the live conference. I do also have data from staff participants, as I previously mentioned, from each of my schools, but I won't be discussing that today within the time limits of this presentation. However, if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to answer them, or indeed if you want to email or tweet me, I'm happy to answer that also. So now just a quick run through of the ideas of the canon and forms of culture. Now, H.R. Leavis's The Great Tradition is a text that we often refer to and think about when we consider how we've arrived at the current text selection for English literature. Leavis prioritised teaching 4 authors who were noted as especially good for teaching the connection between literature and morality: Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, and Joseph Conrad. Actually, of these, Austen, who I have a particular soft spot for, is still on the national curriculum, but all four have been on it at different stages and are still valued highly. We'll go into more details about this in a second. Now, two of the main criticisms of what is traditionally classed as the canon are that it is male-dominated and important women writers are extremely neglected, and that the corpus was dominated by white writers. I'm just putting it out there because I 100% agree with this and wanted to acknowledge it here today. But the concept of the canon is still going to be important for what I talk about. I just don't want to leave such big criticisms left unsaid, or potentially have anyone think that I agree that these four writers are the pinnacle of English literature. Now, why exactly is the canon relevant? Well, because it feeds into this idea of culture. Now, culture is a key theme in the national curriculum for English literature's corpus. This can be interpreted in a variety of ways, with examples ranging from H.R. Leavis's Great Tradition to ex-Education Secretary Michael Gove's cry for British values. Whilst the push for culture to be a key aspect of the corpus selection takes on many forms, it is important to examine why this is the case and the reasoning behind it, and also why what is classified as high culture versus what is low or pop culture has an impact on this. Now, I do go into detail in this in my thesis, but for now I'll just use this example to demonstrate what I mean really briefly for you today. In 2013, Michael Gove, who was at the time the Education Secretary, stated that Stephenie Meyer cannot hold a flaming pitch torch to George Eliot. This is the great tradition of English literature, a canon of transcendent works, and Breaking Dawn is not part of that. Now, there is a lot to unpack here and many reasons why what he said does not sit right with me, but here are my main two takeaways. At this point, George Eliot was not even part of the national curriculum, but this overarching expectation of what was good literature drove Gove to make this comparison and devalue a low, but I prefer the term pop culture novel. Secondly, it was interesting to me that Gove chose specifically to attack something associated with young women and girls, something that they enjoy and encourages the reading connecting with the text. I have read Mill and the Floss, and hand on heart, I'd have to say I connected more with the Twilight Saga, #Team Edward. So it's not even as if reading something pop culture stops engaging with the canon, but sometimes more connection and meaning is found in the reading that young people do outside of school. So devaluing that is extremely damaging. So before this turns into a rant where I define my love of Twilight, let's make a connection to Cox's models. In 1989, Cox and a committee of English experts called for a national curriculum for English inclusive of their 5 models of English. These were, namely, personal growth, cross-curricular, adult needs, cultural heritage, and cultural analysis. So each model provides vital skills or a perspective for students of English. For example, personal growth involves learning to be creative and imaginative with language, and the cross-curricular view states how much English influences pupils' performance in other subjects. The adult needs view highlights how English is a lifelong requirement, that a good grasp of English is vital for tasks such as applying for jobs and filling out paperwork, as well as engaging politically. Now, linking to the canon and forms of culture, we have cultural heritage, which focuses on the need for English culture to be celebrated in the text selection. This model is still present in the national curriculum today, but what I argue in my thesis, and has been highlighted from my research, is the missing piece to accompany it, the cultural analysis model. This highlights how the role of English has potential as a tool for helping pupils work towards a critical understanding of the world around them, and the ways in which meaning can be analysed and conveyed from the text they encounter. Despite Cox's 5 models of English being coined just over 30 years ago, they are still, in my opinion, extremely relevant for addressing the needs of students in the English classroom today. Society should strive for people to have the chance of personal growth and learning to be creative and imaginative with language. Educators should be mindful of the cross-curricular view, as a good grasp of English does influence how well students can perform in other subjects. More than ever, there's a strong need for the adults' need view, as students need to learn how to fill out paperwork and interact with the media and politics long after they finish their compulsory education. In a separate realm of the problematic label of British values, the cultural heritage model is a way to celebrate and showcase the unique nature of English literature. But it is vital to note that without what is most arguably the most important of the 5 models, cultural analysis, that cannot always be possible. The cultural analysis view works towards students being able to view the world and the media that they consume in a critical manner, and develops their understanding of the world around them and the various ways in which meaning can be analysed and conveyed. Having this analysis present alongside the teaching of texts means that there could be potential for students to have the chance to be examined and tested on engaging with the text that they encounter during school through a range of lenses and perspectives. For example, problematic colonial undertones in Bronte's Jane Eyre could be accompanied with a post-colonial reading of the text. This would mean that students were examined more on understanding characters and themes, but also understanding how they fit in the context associated with the time of the text, but also how they fit in with the modern world and what lessons they can learn from that in relating to those themes today. So let's talk about some of my data and the implications relating to it. In my pilot study, where the text that the school was studying was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 80% of participants had not had the chance to learn feminism or gender studies alongside Jekyll and Hyde. And all participants were either wanting that or unsure if they did moving forward, but none of them answered outright no, which I think is really important to note. Of course, it doesn't necessarily have to just be about feminism. For example, as I said with Jane Eyre, it might be more important to learn about the post-colonial lens in that context, or why not both if there is time. My main study data is still not complete at the time of making this presentation, but I can confirm a similar trend is emerging from participants that I've seen so far in their encounters with critical theory alongside the text and in their desire, or rather their non-desire, to have it alongside text. As you can see on this slide, there are some quotations from my pilot group that all relate to Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Here we can see a range of interesting themes emerging. These themes are of course coded in other quotations, but I've just got a snapshot of my data to share with you here today. So let's start with the first quotation. Because it's about class. Like the lower class didn't have any power at all. Imagine being a lower class woman in that time. You'd literally have no power. This was something from a discussion that emerged with that group about there not being any women present in the novel, and linking to that about what kinds of women were excluded from the novel. It was really interesting to note that my participants were so aware of intersections, in this case between class and gender, that were missing in the novel, and that they would like to have explanations about being missing or explanations about why they might not be there. Emerging from talking about themes on the text, we moved on to more troubling present day things that participants had noted. For example, yeah, that's a thing though, that's still a thing. People still say to us, get back in the kitchen. And also, and that's not even starting on it, we're still definitely sexualized. These two quotes emerged when we were talking about whether they thought there was a change in attitudes towards gender from when the time the novel was written and in the present day. Now, it's really interesting to note that these two things are linked to the girls' present day experiences of gender, but the conversation that was brought about these experiences, and that the other participants sadly related to, was through a 19th century novel, and also a novel that doesn't necessarily have that great a show for women, as I'm sure people who are in the audience might be familiar with the novel. There are women characters in it, and to suffer through either being trampled or fainting. For me, these middle two quotes show there is a potential for these 19th century novels to be opening up discourse if we do bring about conversations about, for example, gender studies and feminism alongside the texts, which is potentially a really powerful tool to have in the English classroom for young people. Also, something that was really interesting was even my participants weren't willing to cancel novels that weren't necessarily great for presentations of gender. For example, in this final quote, if you were asking me questions like, is it wrong to teach Jekyll and Hyde, or is it bad because it doesn't represent women? I think it's fine to teach it because that's how it was. And that's kind of what the core of my message is in my research. It's that we shouldn't be not teaching Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde because they are missing representations of certain characters, or they're not necessarily presenting characters in the best ways. But it's about opening up a wider discourse around why that might be, about the historical context of novels, which is still a part of the curriculum, but perhaps not with the most weighting. It's also about equipping young people with the skills for critical engagement and critical analysis that memorizing chunks of text just doesn't provide. And although the English literature curriculum is about more than that, I feel that conversations with my participants in all of my main study as well as my pilot, they wanted to know more. They wanted more context. They wanted that critical theory. And in realizing that collectively together in their focus groups, I think it was really powerful for them to see that what they wanted wasn't something that they personally wanted. It was something that a lot of people wanted and a lot of people could identify. Now, I know I said I wouldn't talk about the staff, but that was also something that the staff interviews were echoing as well. So staff wanted the time, they wanted the resources, and they wanted the abilities to teach this critical theory alongside the text because they felt it would have enhanced understanding, enhanced enjoyment, but it just isn't something that is prioritised with the current examination system. Now, of course, as I said, these are just a few quotes from my pilot school concerning one novel. These ideas about wanting to know more about critical theory and using events, characters, and themes in the novels to reflect on what it means to exist as a young woman today emerged in my other schools with other 19th century novels too. What shone through the most was the passion my participants, both staff and students, had about teaching, learning, and understanding these 19th century texts, even if sometimes that was through pop culture references or their own life examples. So how can I summarise all this? Let's see. Firstly, the data I've discussed with you today came from in-person focus groups, and some of them on Zoom following COVID, with groups of girls who were sitting their GCSE in English literature. My findings show the role that 19th century novels play in navigating their experiences of what it means to be a young woman in the modern world, as well as their desires to enhance their understandings and relationships with these texts through learning critical theory and more context alongside the novels. How would this work realistically? Well, less emphasis based on the word-by-word analysis that is seen, and more about engaging with the text that students encounter during English literature. More about encouraging their own critical thinking and setting them up for their own enjoyments of reading. Yes, even Twilight. Ultimately, also to expect the unexpected when opening up in discussions of young people, even through the medium of a safe 19th century novel. Themes from eating disorders to mental health to sexual harassment all came up when comparing the experiences of characters in the novels to their own and of their peers. It was a pleasure to listen to, and I hope I managed to use as much of the data as possible to present a case for the importance of emphasising the cultural analysis model alongside the cultural heritage we already have. And here are the references I used in today's presentation for your own reference. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for listening and for your attention. Here is my email again and also my Twitter. Any questions now, I'll do my best to answer, but do feel free to contact me through either of these, and I will also be in touch. Thank you very much.